Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh.
So on the show today, Adrian Iselin. So Adrian is joining us from Berlin. He's an embodiment teacher who works through different modalities: intimacy, sexuality, also partner yoga. So that seems to be a big thing. Acro yoga, you may have heard of. We'll dive into what that is. He's joining me in all his bearded, beautiful goodness today. You can't see that on the podcast, but ladies and gay men, just assume a beautiful, beautiful man with a big beard. So Adrian, welcome.
Hey there. Welcome. Thank you so much.
So nice to have you on the show. You're in Berlin today?
Yes, I am. It's where I'm based. I'm German-American, so I tend to move kind of between the West Coast and Berlin, but Berlin is a major home base for me.
Okay. And how do you, the question I was asked to begin, how did you get interested in working with the body? What was your route into this world?
Well, every time the bio question comes up, that's something I try to figure out kind of the most compact version of. I can definitely say that it's a topic that in its outlines is something that has busied my mind really from a teenage time. I mean, I went to school to high school where I was able to major in philosophy. I later studied sociology and philosophy, focused on language game. So this idea about how to connect, how to make meaning, how to express. Was something that I spent a lot of time studying and thinking about. And then for the longest time I was studying, I got my master's in sociology really to go into social science and to be a researcher. And really during my master's program, I really wasn't such a body-focused person up until then. I really discovered, I trained martial arts, I trained Muay Thai for a long time, swing dance, and then eventually discovered partner acrobatics, which just felt like a very holistic practice. And then during my master's study, that became so important and such a focus and so relevant for me, and seemed to really kind of complete a lot of the ideas that I was examining academically on an experiential level. And, if you work in academia, you spend years and years and years and money and time and efforts to try to collect data points to, create a statistically significant sample so you can prove your hypothesis, so you can write a paper, so maybe you can make a policy recommendation so that you can implement this. And it goes so far, and you might not see the results in a lifetime. But when I teach people acro and I show them, hey, put your hip here, have this alignment, try to feel this, it's such an immediate experience. And I feel it gives people such an immediate access to a kind of a truth about themselves, about their body, which is ultimately their vehicle, how they engage with the world. Everyone, no matter what their physical experience is, how close or how sensitive or how blunt or how far away it seems, that is their access point to the world. So it feels the more I can give people access to being in tune with their body, whatever it means for each individual, the more I can actually fulfill this mission of seeking truth and seeking also access to happiness. And really this thing of self-actualization that we get in humanistic psychology is really kind of my main motivator there. And partner movement has seemed like one of the most powerful tools that have come across in that context.
So you grew up in the States or in Germany? So you're half and half, right?
Right. My mom's American, my dad's German, and I grew up in the southwest of Germany, kind of near the French border, kind of going to see American family a lot while I was growing up. Language was always a big topic, as I mentioned, so also immersing myself kind of in these two cultural and lingual realms was a big part of my also kind of cultural identity growing up, and also kind of becoming the individual experience that I find myself in today. So that's always been very present. I've always translated a lot, worked a lot in language as well. So I've probably spent more years in Germany, but since my 20s, I've been pretty much 50-50 between Germany and the States.
Mm-hmm. Culture is one of our sort of big themes on the show. So if that comes up, then feel free to speak to that. Why don't we start with this sort of acro revolution? So, I first did yoga 22 years ago. There wasn't such a thing as acro yoga as far as I know then. Mm-hmm. And maybe 5-10 years ago, it started coming on my radar, this thing, acro yoga, and all these cool pictures started appealing and appearing. And then I went to a class locally. There's a very good teacher locally in Brighton, and, balancing on someone's feet while they were lying on their back. I'm trying to paint a picture for those that have never seen it. I mean, Google it. But basically, if you imagine one person lying on their back with their feet in the air and the other person sort of, they call it flying, the flyer on top, and there may also be a spotter, right? A third person who's there as a sort of safety person to catch them. And I immediately thought, wow, this is very interesting psychologically, because there's issues of trust and safety. I remember, trust, belonging, safety, communication, connection. I remember one senior acro yoga teacher in Britain came up to me and they said, Mark, why do I feel so emotional at the end of teaching acro? Because to him, it was just a bit of fun. It didn't have it's almost yoga in brackets for some people, right? It's just more like a bit of fun. And I said, well, because you're dealing with these core psychodynamic issues all day, and that may potentially be, affecting you, as well as the psoas and blah, blah, blah. So, what is kind of acro yoga for those that don't know what that is in your words? Because my version there might have been a bit crude. And what's the psychological side of that? That's what I'm really interested in.
Absolutely. Well, in terms of where does it come from? I think it's really important to understand the part of yoga. I think a lot of people see acro yoga, and to this day, people come to my classes and I was like, "Oh, I thought this was yoga. I don't really recognize the yoga part." Yoga in its essence is mindfulness practice. Mm-hmm. The asana part of yoga is the physical component. If you look at the Eightfold Path, it's this idea of meditation and pranayama being in the beginning, then eventually moving into asana, and then moving into kind of more spiritual practices along the yogic path. So this kind of form of asana yoga that you see, taught in studios and that's become so popular is really only one segment of yoga. So really anything that you do mindfully and that you do with intention and that you use as a tool to improve your understanding of self and other and nature and your environment can be yogic.
Yeah, so we could use that definition of yoga as any sort of transformative body-mind practice as a wide definition of yoga, and asana being one popular way of doing that, right? So we could go back to that and use it in a much more extended way. I've heard people say, well, Buddhism's a kind of yoga, because it's a transformative practice.
Absolutely. And there's a transformative quality in anything. I think any practice that you relate to, it can be shibari bondage, it can be food, it can be nutrition, it can be CrossFit, it can be Excel tables. If it's a tool that somehow allows you to engage with yourself, an understanding of self, other, and the world, this triad that's quite significant for me in my work. There can be a yogic quality to it. I think there are some practices, the more holistic the practice, the fewer restrictions there are within the practice, the more suitable it tends to be as a tool. So what I experience in partner acrobatics, it's one of the few movement disciplines where there's very few rules. And really the closest thing to rules are really recommendations in terms of what kind of movements and what kind of techniques are the most efficient, the most stable, the safest, that require the least effort. While, I remember, when I was more focused on martial arts, I was like, boxing, so weird. You can only use your hands, but I have so much more. What do you mean I can't use my foot? I just did. It's absolutely within what's available. And with acro yoga, with partner acrobatics, it's more a matter of how can you integrate more? How can you do, how can you remove limits rather than be like, no, to play this game, you must only stay within these parameters. So that's why it's a very suitable tool for me. And there's so much in it. I have the on the psychological level, I have the trust component. I have the communication component. I spend a lot of time doing exercises, and quite subtly and quite playfully and quite fluently. I don't necessarily sit people down and tell them, okay, now we're doing the trust part. It's going to get real serious. I just do a little exercises to give people a sense of oh, wow, if I move slowly and if I set my upcoming motions up with clear cues, and if I move in a way that's that's easy to anticipate for my partner, we'll move much more integratedly. We are much more stable. We're much stronger. We're much more together. So there's a lot that plays into in partner acrobatics and practicing clear and nonviolent communication. I talk to people a lot about, it can feel like the other person is fucking up your move. Like they're the ones that are, not doing their part or they're inhibiting it. But you're always doing it together. And then the question is, what can we do together? How can I help compensate? How can we balance each other out? And the more I stress the other person out, telling them, you got to do this, chest up, feet down, whatever it is. What's the way that I can suggest that to them that makes them understand it and want to do it and flow with it? So there's so many components. And while it can look quite, I don't want to really say trivial, but it can look quite simple from the outside. Our whole physical experience is very heavily oriented towards feet on the ground, head up, walking or sitting, and laying. Those are kind of really the main physical modes that we find ourselves in. So there's actually a lot that happens when suddenly we're resting on our hips, we're upside down, or on our hands, I really see also, people are really, handstand is one of these fascinating physical skills that are quite simple, but quite powerful in how they work. So I think partner acrobatics and acro yoga is a very simple but powerful tool to access different modes of physical experience, of world experience, and to tune in with all the subtle little ways. And in that way, it's also quite related to the psychedelic state, I feel. Just this very simple push, this very simple shift that shows you a whole nother aspect about how we relate with ourselves in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I explored some embodied yoga, which is what I do in relationship to partner yoga and acro yoga in Brussels recently. We did a workshop with a local teacher on this, and it was quite interesting. And I found the challenge was it was so exciting that unless people were already pretty experienced, they didn't have much space to necessarily see a lot was going on. And what we did was slow it down and stop people, and we rang a bell and just said, okay, notice how you're doing right now. Notice your arousal levels. Notice how you're communicating. Notice if you really like the spotter role, or you're over taking care of people, you're caretaking, or you're not taking care, or you've become a complete control freak and you're telling your partner what to do. We kind of just gave people a little bit of space to start to, because it always struck me that there's a lot. There's two things I think are difficult. One is it's just super hard to be mindful when you're kind of upside down and scared. It's quite advanced posture to meditate in, as it were. And the second one was it's very visual. So I remember when acro came out, I wonder, it seemed to me one of the reasons it was so successful in spreading. I think because people were longing for a partner practice in yoga. People had done a lot of yoga, and there was a lot of like me on my own on my mat, and they were longing for some connection. And I think the other reason is it looks so cool. And if I look at your website, it's beautiful. There's really great graphics and great videos. I mean, it's very easy in a sort of media visual age to spread images of acro compared to other things, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So I think it's a sort of mixed blessing, though, maybe, that visual appeal. What do you think to that?
I think there's, then within acro, you kind of get this subsegment of this, social media orientation where people learn a new trick and the first thing they want to do is take a video, take a picture. And, someone who's a little more experienced sees that it's really still pretty shaky. Like the arms aren't extended, you're rushing the trick. Like it's really from what it could be, not maybe even all there. But of course, it's also sharing excitement, And I noticed for myself, I'm kind of in a weird place with my practice, or in a kind of tricky place with my practice, in as much as I've advanced to a place where, to kind of also with standing acrobatics, to skill level where, to even do certain things, to even do, dynamic moves, pitches, high hand to hands, things like this, you need a partner with a certain skill set to even be able to train some of these things. So the people that pool of people shrinks the more demanding the skill set becomes, and then most people who have that skill set are either in circus and are very performance oriented, or they are in competition, and then they're only focused on training towards a competition.
That's not yoga at that point, is it? That's a performance, and I think the difference between yoga and performance is yoga has an internal focus, and performance has an external focus, right? And you might have an external focus as well, but it always has that, as you said earlier, the mindful quality. And I've seen that go out the window. I've been at acro workshops, which are really fun. I mean, I really recommend it to anyone because it's so much fun. And you don't have to be super athletic to do it. You can give it, as a 70-year-old woman giving it a go in the workshop I was teaching. But sometimes the focus, I remember one workshop I was at, it felt like a photo shoot. Like everyone had their phones out and, everyone was taking pictures. And I wonder if that's not a risk of such a beautiful practice.
Fully. And this is, again, I think also a big difference between like circus and acro yoga. Acro yoga, as you said, is inward directed. It's directed towards the experience of it. And what I notice, actually, the more people are in their practice and the more they really feel the movement and they feel the extension, and their muscle chains are connected in a way that the motion in their fingertip, they can feel it in their toes. When that's there, the picture looks the best. When people are moving in the way that they're trying to imitate their external image of what someone else is doing, it often looks a bit cramped, a bit, it's kind of the similar, it's there, but like this extension and this lengthening and this like really full feeling isn't there. So actually those, they are related in a way. but people do get a bit focused on the impression, on the external impression. And I also think, though, that there's a twofold motivation in there. I think there are people who want to impress, and again, it's all on the spectrum. I think there's a bit of every motivation in every action. It's just a question of what's in the foreground, what's dominant. But I think, it can sometimes be a little more like making an impression oriented, but it can also just be like, wow, I did this thing that I can't even comprehend still exactly how it works. I mean, there's still tricks that I teach, very regularly that I'm still like, I mean, I know how to do it and I get it, but I'm still even slightly surprised that it works so well and that it like is so effortless and that this turns and that this rotates and that this stays and that it doesn't hurt. And then if I'm, an inch over, it does hurt. And it's so subtle in the way that it's possible in the body. I think if our anatomy was slightly different, maybe partner acrobatics wouldn't even really quite work that way, or they would work differently anyway.
Yeah. I get what you're saying about the relationship between mindfulness and beauty, that there is a way in which, and this works on so many levels in life, right? When we're not trying to impress people, we're more beautiful, on so many levels that works. And I wonder, and this is a wider question, not just for you, and I'm certainly not aiming this at you in particular, I wonder if kind of jockeying for social status, which is essentially what I see is going on in the body-mind world in a lot of visual imagery. It's like, I'm sexy, I'm athletic, I'm beautiful, I'm cool, whatever, whether it's male, female, whatever, like that jockeying for social status and hierarchy, essentially. I wonder if that is a wholesome sort of motivation for any body mind practice, or, maybe I'm being a snob here, I don't know. It seems like that's, in the sort of time I've been involved in body mind practice, that's got more of a thing. And like, maybe the yoga world is, and acro yoga is almost at the front edge of that. And I don't want to be just critical here and be like, oh, these kids with their Instagram, because I actually see a real benefit in beauty and visuals, and you know what I mean? Like,
totally.
What do you think? Sam? I'm just thinking out loud here. So this isn't aimed at you. This is as much. I just spent an hour on Instagram, so I kind of, got this in my mind.
No, totally. I fully share that. I think I kind of that cynical edge, creeps into my mind occasionally as well.
Yeah.
I think for the most part, I really try to focus on this idea that people are just excited and that they want to share, and that I think looking also at videos and older material and kind of talking to older acrobats. There's really so many also acrobats really still in the 50s and the 60s who are still doing this stuff, which I think also really speaks for the practice. People are starting to learn much more demanding and difficult skills much earlier on because there's so much audiovisual material. I think, like 30 years ago, you had to go to like a skilled circus show to see something like a hand-to-hand. And if you didn't go to the circus, there was really no way to see it and see it close enough that you could actually learn how to do it. And now you get so many images of it and tutorials and stills and explanations and whatnot that you can actually learn fairly proficiently online.
Getting a VHS of an Aikido demonstration from Paris, and someone had made this grainy VHS video, and we were all looking at it in my Aikido club, and it was like, wow, we'd never seen Tissier Sensei from Paris, and we were all so excited, and we're like, what's that technique? And we're trying to rewind it, but it hasn't really got the technology now where you could pause it and blow it up and put it in slow motion. And I remember like that was really exciting. It was the first video of Aikido I'd ever seen. It was before YouTube. And and now, I'd imagine it'd be quite a different environment to be learning Aikido, which is my home art, in the kind of modern context where there's so much great content out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I ultimately really support anyone that feels drawn, to interrupt their practice to take a picture. Maybe there's a primary vanity orientation or motivation. Ultimately, it creates an image. It'll be a reference for themselves in the future. It'll be a reference to their friends. I really notice that I'm most drawn to performance less as this, opportunity to be on stage, but as an opportunity to show people a practice, to show them some movements that they've maybe never seen before. And I still quite regularly, even in Berlin, where I think everyone knows acrobatics, everyone's an acrobat, everyone knows circus. I do, I think Berlin lends itself very much to these kind of like more unconventional kind of club, impromptu kind of
a town full of clowns. That's
totally very much so.
Berlin who are listening, it's pretty alternative and pretty counterculture, isn't it? It's a sort of, it's a mecca for the alternative.
Absolutely. And then, and so many people who are performance oriented are, come to Berlin because there's such a broad stage for it. And even here, I'll do like even quite simple flows or movements or even just jamming, and people are so like, whoa. I remember being at a club and people were like diving in to like hold the flyer because they were sure that they were going to crash to their death, and are like, no, it's cool, we got it. Just
so do you do performances in nightclubs, for example? I have an acro teacher friend of mine who regularly teaches sex parties and nightclubs and some pretty debauched venues that I can't imagine his normal yoga teacher would imagine this would be a venue. Do you teach at places like that?
There are definitely kind of actually I'm quite drawn to the festival context. So I actually, well, first of all, because I quite enjoy the atmosphere and the environment of the concept of the festival. I think we get a good selection of festivals also in Germany that aren't too heavily drug people, that aren't too music focused. And I really actually have a project called the Soul Surf Salon, where we have a mobile workshop space, and we're a crew of acro, contact, massage, yoga, dance teachers, and go to different festivals and just bring with us a whole workshop curriculum offer. So festivals that want to bring some more interactive content to the festivals can just book us, and we do the whole thing, and we bring spaces and mats and everything you need, because it's a space where people are very available. They have time. They're prepared to experiment. They're not concerned about their schedule, and it's very easy to pick them up and do stuff with them. I really enjoy these venues, because that's when a lot of people actually, I find, when I teach kind of on a day-to-day level, they're a little more careful and a little more like, got to go to work tomorrow, or, got to stay in good health, or whatever it is. And they're much more prepared. I get much more, a lot more people who maybe wouldn't do it otherwise.
Yeah, I find people, I've taught embodied yoga principles at quite a lot of festivals, and people are quite up for it. They're like, right, we're on holiday, we're on a festival, right? They just go full in, give it. And there's nothing quite like, 100 people in a tent kind of really going for it. And there can be a real pleasant vibe with that, for sure. But okay. So we've talked a little bit about the sort of social media. There's an interesting fact I heard, which is teenage pregnancy has gone down in the UK, and they think it's because teenage girls are getting their validation from social media rather than having sex with men. I thought that was a fascinating fact. And
I could very much see that.
So maybe there's a positive to all that validation. I think you're a little more forgiving than I am of it. And then you also talked there about the psychology. I mean, say a little bit more, because I feel like you're a real expert here, and I'd love to hear more of your take on it. Like, what is some of the psychology that you see come up when people are, say, doing a handstand, or when people are balancing on their partner? What do you see happen between couples?
Actually, I think on an individual level, and then I'll also talk about the couple dynamic level. On an individual level, I think one of the most powerful skills that acrobatics has is that on a day-to-day level, in terms of the actions that we perform, the decisions that we make, we're very heavily oriented towards a strong point of orientation is our anticipation. What we think works, how we think things are going to work out. And I notice that people actually have very strong conceptions about what they think they can do, what they think they're able of. And it tends to be a strong inhibitor because people have a lot of assumptions about, well, I can do this, and the other person's going to be like this. And the pure experience of doing something that you were sure is not going to work out, and then feeling that it does work out, and reliably so, is a huge psychological element, is a huge psychological experience. And is very related, I think, also to sparring. If anyone who's done martial arts, the first time they step into the ring, I think one of the biggest psychological hurdles to overcome is not flinching when someone's punching at you.
Yeah.
The first thing you learn in the ring is to keep looking at your opponent rather than turn away, close your eyes, turn your back on your opponent. And it's similar in acro. A lot of people start closing their eyes or curling up when they feel like they're going to fall, or when they get overwhelmed. So the staying in the moment and the psychological experience, just even of knowing I was so sure I couldn't do that, or it wasn't possible, and then it was possible, really transfers into the rest of the world. It transfers to projected emotions. It transfers to the way we communicate in dispute. When we go in and we think like, oh, all I want to tell them is that, we had this fight, but it's okay now. But I know that if I'm sweet to them, they're just going to take advantage, and they're going to be mean to me. And it's going to be, we have all these anticipations, and just, and having that experience, I think really allows us to go in and is like, I think it's going to be like this, but I'm just going to go with what I think and enter into the situation with integrity. And I'm prepared for it to actually be different than what I think.
Yeah, I think working with fear, whether it's parkour or martial arts or acro, is super, super helpful, isn't it? To work with limiting beliefs that I can't do it, then you do, then you go, oh, hang on a minute, maybe I'm bigger than I thought, maybe I'm capable of more than I thought. There's something very empowering about overcoming a limiting belief and realizing, that most of what holds you back is yourself rather than actual reality. And then working with fear, because that's just a key aspect of life, whether it's asking that girl out on a date or going for a promotion or, there's always fear and expectation around that, which is holding us back. So I think doing something fairly regularly where you're scared and you don't get hurt is a fairly big growth experience for a lot of people.
Fully. And I mean, this is really the essence of yoga, of this mindfulness practice of managing these challenges. And, I think, how to say, our kind of cognitive capacities for any emotion, they can grow and they can expand, but there are also, limited in a way. So you kind of like your pain experience maxes out, your joy experience kind of maxes out at one point. So the more you engage with your feelings and kind of the extent of them, you can experience expansion, but generally you become less overwhelmed. These like intense where you just totally lose your mind, whether it's for joy or for anger or for jealousy or whatever the feeling is. You're able to surf it a little more. And there's actually this image of surfing has become really significant to me, in the sense that, when you go out in the ocean, no one really thinks that they can defeat a wave. Like you can't surf a wave by telling the wave, hey, okay, you got to slow it down. Don't go taller than this. Like, this is what I'm comfortable with. Like, it doesn't work that way. You have to work with what the wave is. And that's really the way every day works. Every day you go out on the street, maybe it's fairly safe in your neighborhood, or, it's not even a matter of purely safety, but you don't know what's going to come at you. And the more you develop your skills of just dealing with whatever comes, whether it's retreating, whether it's engaging, whatever it is, this builds your strength, your integrity, and it also maximizes the joy and pleasure and connectedness you feel with the world and with the people and all the elements that it's constituted of.
Yeah, because when there isn't fear, there's much more capacity for love and connection and creativity and all those other things, right? So it's not just about not fearing. And like shit happens in life. And I feel like most people who aren't doing a practice like this, they're not just not prepared when something difficult and overwhelming happens. Whereas, if you've been doing jiu-jitsu every day and someone's, you spend an hour a day, someone trying to strangle you unconscious, then the thing that happens is also a bit difficult at work. It's like, okay, it's just one more person trying to strangle you. It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Or like just being upside down in a handstand. That's a weird thing to do, right? So your system's just getting used to doing challenging, scary things to the point where you go, okay, not the end of the world. I can surf this, as you say.
Yeah, fully. And you also take it less and less personal. And, I really like this book about the 4 agreements. And one of the agreements is, don't take things personally. It's happening and it is specific to your experience, but don't make it about you. It's happening, deal with it, and keep going.
Also, that fear becomes exciting, right? You develop a different relationship to it. Like, if I said to the average guy, you walk up to that girl you find attractive and go ask her name and ask for a phone number, they find that terrifying, whereas I'd find that just really fun and exciting. Like that's just not a problem. It's just like, wow, this is going to be an adrenaline rush, fantastic. Like what a great rush this is going to be, as opposed to like, oh god, I'm terrified. I'm so used to fear, I'm not able to deal with that sensation, right? So you start processing fear as a good thing in some ways, of like, okay, I'm on my edge here. That's quite nice,
Fully, and at the same time, I also really try to stay present with, how it feels at the very beginning, because I remember the first time I got punched in the face, which was fortunately during, within a more or less safe, training container, but it was really quite a significant experience, because I think there's so much cultural weight attached to getting punched in the face. Like the worst thing that someone can do to you. It's disrespectful. It's painful. You're marked. It can threaten your job depending on what you're doing. If you're in sales or if you're in, kind of a more front-facing kind of industry, it can mean not being able to go. I mean, there's a lot attached to it. But then getting punched in the face and kind of realizing it's not such a big deal, and having a shiner is not such a big deal, and you kind of, and then you're able to actually face that. I'm quite a big proponent of getting punched in the face. I'm like, I don't want people to get hurt.
I mean, evolutionary-wise, men have faces which have been designed to be punched. I mean, this is why we have bone mass on our cheeks and our forehead, which develops as we hit puberty. Our faces are literally evolved to be punching bags. So it's amazing. In the same way antlers have horns, it's just something we've evolved for. So, this is why this is the hard bit, the human attack. But so okay, getting punched, we recommend that in the safety of a loving consensual relationship, obviously.
Yes.
I think the consent part's important here, and the control part, so people aren't just getting overwhelmed, right? Because if they go to acro or boxing and they just get overwhelmed, then it deepens the fear. It doesn't help them deal with it.
I wouldn't punch someone unless they asked for it. Literally.
It's good. So
I'm happy to punch them, and I'm happy for them to ask them to punch me,
Oh, we do that with the Systema friends of mine. After a while, it's like, oh, that was a good one. It kind of sounds good. And we are sort of going into the S&M territory almost here. So maybe we should just allow that segue to happen. You mentioned Japanese rope work earlier.
Yeah.
Is that something we've never had anyone on the show from that tradition? Is it Shibari?
Shibari, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is that something you're involved with?
I am not too heavily involved with it. It does have a lot of. I've dabbled with it. I say dabble just because I also know so many people who are so highly adept at it and really,
You're not a black belt.
Basic awareness of the complexity of it. Say again.
You're not a black belt level at tying people up.
No, definitely yellow. If I think wishfully. I have a also based on body work and acro, rudimentary understanding of where not to put ropes, like how the knots should work to not cinch tighter. I'm just currently exploring one of my first kind of performance pieces that I'm really developing to use rope and acro, because you're effectively attaching a handle to a person, and it's another place to acro off of. There's a really great kind of body work. I appreciate it as a tool. I find people sometimes get a little bit attached to it as an easy access point to intimacy. I think without attachment and and staying playful and light and explorative with it, not using it too much also as a power dynamic vibe, I think it has a lot of potential. And it deals with a lot of similar kind of components as acro, in the sense of as the flyer, if you're tied, and you start having feelings of restraint or upset, and you're in the rope. I mean, someone can cut you loose, but even untying takes time. Yeah. And it really is an exercise in impulse control. And a big part of also my acro teachings, I tell people this is an exercise. When you're the flyer, you're the spotter, and you feel like you're not doing anything, you're exercising impulse control, staying focused, keeping your shape, and actually avoiding all of those things, all the balancing, all the hand waving. That is your active practice right now. Yeah. And that plays a huge role in rope for sure.
Yeah, I think there's something about being sort of tied up, or in an Aikido, I might be in an arm lock, for example. And that in itself is also a practice. I'm in a practice where I completely can't move, especially if someone's decent to put a wrist lock or an arm lock on you. It's like you are, very submissive in a way at that point. There's a way in which you can still stay alive and reactive as a martial artist. It's not quite submissive, but there's a practice in that vulnerability. There's a practice in that, because if you get reactive in an arm lock, it's the exact same thing. It's not good. It's gonna make it hurt more. There's a very clear, with arm locks and wrist locks, there's a very quick conditioning, because it just hurts more if you struggle. Now, you're in Berlin, and you're a friend of Melissa's, so I'm assuming you're at least a bit kinky. And I know the Berlin, for those who's stroking his beard right now, for those that don't know, Berlin is kind of the kink capital of Europe. Is that fair to say?
I think there's a reasonable grounds for such a statement. Yeah.
Yes, and I've only seen your other websites. So tell us about your work with intimacy and sexuality. Let's segue to that sort of side of what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, I struggle a little bit with this expression kink, because I always think of a kink as we talk about a kink as something that's defective, like a dent, something when it's less of what it should be, then it's kinked. It's kinky. And I feel like to me, sex positivity and sexual expression and sexual empowerment and embodiment is really more about self-actualization. It's more about making a whole of myself, rather than celebrating my perversion. Also these like pervert and proud, and a lot of these kind of sex positive kind of taglines, I always feel a little bit, it's like, I get what it's trying to do, but in a way it's affirming a negative mindset.
Yeah, like there's a normal that's somehow broken or twisted or kinked, literally, as opposed to, I'd frame it very much the other way, like, hey, this is actually a more expansive, more inclusive, more conscious kind of view of human sexuality, if done in a certain way. And that is not, it's not broken, quite the opposite. It's evolved, it's expanded.
Absolutely. And, there's so much shame, self-shame, shame from partners, shame from society on a larger level about sexuality, about sexual desire. I mean, especially for women, this classic of like, all of society badgers you to be sexual and to show your body. And then when you do, you did it wrong.
It's a tricky situation, I think, in the mainstream world for women, in the alternative world for men. I feel that kind of shaming is reversed when you come to more alternative cultures where it's the guy's sexuality that's really frowned upon. And I wonder if the world's going to swing back that way actually as well, rather than balancing it out. And you mentioned sex positivity. Now I know what that is, but I'm not sure everyone will. Do you want to say what sex positivity is as a movement?
The general idea around the fundamental premise of sex positivity is an attitude towards sexuality as a normal, healthy, and necessary part of the human expression and human connection. Like I said, my background's in sociology, so I really refer a lot to people like Maslow, and people might know Maslow from the hierarchy of needs, where we have, where he says, we focus in a certain order on the satisfaction of our desires, and food, shelter, and sex are on the very first tier of where our mind goes of, I need to have these things secured. Before
it's hard to think about philosophy if you're starving, right? And if sex is in there, it's like if there isn't some healthy sexual expression, satisfaction, it's very tricky to be worrying about other needs.
Fully.
And that's very much my experience. Maybe I'm just a randy pervert, but my experience is if I'm not well laid, and I mean, a loving, connected way on a regular basis, I mean, I'm just not really good for anything. I'm just distracted as much as anything else, right?
Very much so. And it's one of our fundamental drives. And, I think for me, with sexuality, this has been a big topic for me. I mean, I've really actually been in open relationships, really from the earliest point. I've had actually very few, if any, kind of conventional monogamous one-on-one relationships, which doesn't mean that my relationships have been, lacking dedication or loyalty. Actually, quite to the contrary. And this is even something I find people are surprised about when I meet partner, even under this kind of polyamorous, open relating context. They're like, "Oh wow, it feels like you really kind of want a relationship." And I was like, "Yes,
yeah."
No, I don't just fuck around. That's polysexuality, which is legitimate in its own right. But really, this idea of polyamory is like, I actually want to be able to express and explore and deepen my love for you as an individual, and I want there to be space for any expression and desire that comes up with the people around. And that doesn't mean that any person that walks down the street that's going to happen with. Sure. It's still a rare occurrence, but I wouldn't want to have to be restricted, nor restrict a partner, a friend, a lover of mine to say, oh, here's an irrelevant person that's come into your life, and how you express your affection for them, I'm going to limit because of my insecurities, ultimately.
Sure.
And more fundamentally, even,
it's very interesting. Sorry.
I'll finish the sentence. I'm curious what you have to say. Is that fundamentally, living in an open relation framework, you are actually reaffirming your relationship with each other every time. Every time you hang out, you actually have to make a plan. You're not just defaulting, oh, this is the person at home. This is the person I'm supposed to have sex with because I'm not allowed to have sex with anyone else. Every time I connect with them, it's a reaffirmation. I choose you over anyone else I could be connecting with in my social realm.
And it's not fear-based, right? Because normally the monogamy, disgusting, unnatural, sexual anorexic way of doing things is, I'm half joking, is this idea that sort of, we're terrified to be with anyone else. And it's the only situation I know in life where when we love someone, we ask them to be less free. We wouldn't say, for example, to a friend we loved, hey, because you're my friend, you have to do what I say. And you can't be friends with anyone else because you're my friend. Now we're friends, that's it. Okay. Yeah. And it's something very, people say to me as a polyamorous, but aren't you afraid? What if you fall in love, or what if and I'm like, well, people do that anyway. Like, people leave their husbands' monogamous relationships every day for their secretaries or whatever, Or they think, hey, so it's not intimate. Oh, so you don't really care about each other, right? Because you're poly. So, therefore you're not as intimate as monogamous people. And people are always really surprised to see me and my wife. And like, wow, you guys really love each other and you're really close and your communication's fantastic. And I'm like, yep. And the other big one we get is like, but what about jealousy? And I'm like, yes, that's a human emotion. And sometimes I feel jealous. That sometimes I feel angry. Sometimes I feel scared. And all of those things are part of my emotional range as a human being. Why is that emotion considered so awful that we should do everything to prevent it, and it doesn't prevent it anyway? This is one of those subjects where I think the more you think about it, the more you see how illogical the normal setup is. And, of course, each to their own, whatever works for people. But yeah.
Very much so. And I think, this is kind of this deficiency thinking, as I like to call it, which, I see this kind of, this kind of expression pair. It's not my coining, culture of abundance and culture of deficiency, where, the one culture, the one kind of action framework suggests an idea that there is more than enough of anything that you could desire in the world, and acting from that place by being generous, and even if it feels limited, just giving it away, or sharing it as much as you like, of course, not as an obligation.
Sure.
It will come back, because if you're creating this feeling of reciprocity and openness, that's how people will want to engage with you. And if you act from a place of deficiency, of feeling like I have to hoard everything, I have to keep a tight lockdown on everything, first of all, you spend so much time trying to isolate and secure and lock down your resources, which includes social capital such as love and care and attention. You drive yourself crazy, and you don't secure it any better. And then also
you're pushing people away.
Totally, fully. And people see you as a deficient person.
This is just bad sales strategy as someone that works in business. It's like, if I come to a client and I'm like, I have to have you as a client and I can't lose you as a client. I mean, that's just a terrible start to any relationship. Or do you know what I mean? And when there's a certain freedom and spaciousness, the opposite, in fact, happens. But, I wonder if this is a force for disembodiment. We've had various neo-tantra teachers come on and talk about connection and sex positivity, but I don't think we've hit polyamory before. And I remember speaking to someone, and I said to this person, they said, sex life isn't very good with my husband, and we're not really connecting that way. And I said, oh, okay, how's that happened? And they said, well, because I'm supposed to not look at other men sexually, what I've practiced all day for the last 15 years is sort of disembodying, is desexualizing myself, because she felt so guilty when she even had a sexual urge, around another man, that she would kind of push that down and repress it. And then, of course, eventually what happened is when she was with her husband, she just spent so much time practicing being non-sexual that even with her husband had been sort of squashed and repressed. And I wonder if it's not a force for disembodiment. And obviously you could be monogamous while, still noticing your sexual urges and enjoying that in your body without acting upon it. So I feel like that's, as valid, but I often definitely see a sort of denial of the fact that you find other people attractive. People are freaked out when, I'll say to my wife, oh, look at that guy, isn't he gorgeous? Look at this nice German guy with a big beard, isn't he attractive young man? And she'll say, yeah, he's really hot, and I'll be like, yeah, he's, I'm just not worried by that. Like, what's the problem?
It's so fun to share that compersion and to be able to say, the fact that you're happy and that I can enable that, and that I can empower you and I can uplift you and I can support you in, seeking out the things that you enjoy, sharing your joy, being like, hey, isn't that great? Because you really also get access to a whole nother part of your partner, which is fully absent. You do not get to understand how people see and what they're attracted to in other people, because by definition, you're you. And as rich as that may be, there are always going to be people who are different than you. And there's always going to be something else that's attractive. And, for me, a really fundamental idea around any kind of relating is that every person I relate to is a mirror. Every person that I engage with activates and engages different parts of me that, just by the definition of what that is, can't all lie in the same person. For the very circumstance that someone who looks different, talks different, comes from a different place, will engage different parts of me. So the more, and there's a finite number. It's not a matter of infinity, but having a sufficient number of mirrors to mirror the full spectrum of who you are as a person, by these relationships. And it gets fractal, like it gets quite infinitesimal, like what that exactly means if you want to get definitory about it. But I find like 3, 4, 5 involved relationships of which the sexual relating can be a part of. And I think more than anything, sex positivity means not banning that idea, rather than creating an obligation to have to act in that way. Creates a very complete sense of self, creates a very rich experience of life, and ultimately a very broad and fecund foundation upon which to relate.
Yeah, and I just say maybe it doesn't work for everyone, but for me, that's there's certainly a lot of healthiness in there. And when people really look at it, there's some of the problems. People, what about STIs? What about this? Or a lot of the kind of, it's like being a vegetarian. You get asked the same 10 boring questions again and again and again, all of which are quite easy. Yes, it is possible to get protein if you're a vegetarian. There's the same sort of questions. In a way, I'm thinking it brings us a bit full circle back to acro, because what we're really talking about here is communication, right? Like it does, whether that's a physical communication of sexuality, a verbal communication of sexuality, or in the acrobatics context, essentially what we're talking about is communication in all of this.
Fully. And it's all, every interaction with someone is a conversation, whether it's sex, whether it's acro, whether it's a fight, whether it's a musical jam. You are sending out cues, you're receiving cues, and you're responding to those cues. And ultimately, you're expressing something and you're receiving something. And the more tuned in that communication is, the more enriching that dialogue and that interaction is. So to me, a lot about positivity culture, about self-actualization, around open relating, around partner movement, around the yogic mindfulness practice is expanding these cues, getting this full mirror of myself, and enriching the experience that we have as the soul's riding the cosmic dust machine that is our body, And,
I don't regard doing an interview as that different from doing acro yoga now. It's like I'm kind of the base, the interviewee is the flyer. Sometimes I get interviewed on other podcasts and, I maybe speak a bit more. For example, I'm going, am I being a good base here? Maybe I'm talking too much. And then it's like, is the communication good? Am I taking that too far? Was that joke okay or not? I've noticed I listen back to all these interviews. And because I never really hear them when I'm doing them, I'm in a different mode, and I want to learn from the people on the interviews. And what I notice is the best interviews are always the one where the person, like we are now, as I experience it, is having a conversation with me.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because some interviews you hear and it's like canned. They've got their little speech and their little bit of fucking marketing publicity. They speak back. And I try not to have those guests on, but we've all got a bit of it in us. We've all been influenced by the sort of American marketing spiel kind of vibe. And it's like I invite listeners, when you're listening to the podcast, to listen to, like, where is there a real conversation? And I feel like this is a good example. And where is there not? And you'll hear the difference, and it's percentage, right? You'll hear you'll hear the difference. Like, are there any other sort of major aspects to your work that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
I feel like we've gotten to go really in a nice, pretty full spectrum right here, and I really appreciate your questions. I feel like they've given a good space to take it in whatever direction feels relevant to me as a speaker, and also to hear kind of where we vibe and relate on these topics. But yeah, ultimately, I think this idea of privilege is always a bit tricky, because I acknowledge that, even just there's so many aspects of my life through which I am very privileged, and I feel very privileged. And a big part of, that experience of privilege has been my desire to take what, the insights that privilege has allowed me to attain, and somehow create something from that benefits the world. And to me, this idea of, also on the sociological level, I've spent a lot of time with happiness studies. There are these like happiness index by the UN. There's different ways, different approaches to try to quantify and empiricize happiness.
Yep.
And, have a really strong idea also to the political dimension of partner practice and mindfulness practice, that ultimately, we have so many examples of, be it UKIP in the UK, or the AFD in Germany, or fucking the Orange Clown in America, and the US.
To me, well, the Orange Clown, I understand who you mean. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I get you now.
They're symptoms. They're not illnesses. It's an expression of a discontent, and it's an expression of a lacking access to joy and happiness and fulfillment. So to me, I feel every time I give a class, whether there's 3 people in the class, or whether it's 120 people in the class, or whether it's an integrated group of like 10, 15 people, and we do like a weekend thing, I feel very confidently that even, if I'm not fully on my game one day, which actually really I feel very motivated when I come into class, and it's always a really good experience for me, 9 out of 10 anyway. I feel that at least in the most incremental fashion, and sometimes in the very large substantial fashion, I've given people at least a space for them to tune in with something that they enjoy. Yeah. And the more people have access to joy and understanding something that they can do for themselves to make themselves happy and to give joy to other people, be it through body work. I also do an orgy lab. I also do a kind of a weekend workshop that pertains to that kind of discusses and treats on a kind of discussion level, also on a physical level, the challenges and joys of the sociosexual space. That
was the perfect combination of Californian and German, and I love how casually you just dropped in, like you didn't say it in a German accent, but I was just imagining it as, oh yeah, we do the orgy lab, it's no big deal. So it's like, okay, that's perfect. That's a perfect cultural impregnation right there. The orgy lab.
Yes. I mean, that's all an orgy can ever be, right? Is a laboratory. And I think the more consciously we go into it and the more we really see it, again, the surfing as what's happening and, how can we ride and what's experience that we can have. It's another way to access joy and pleasure and togetherness. And I think the more ways and the more sustainable our access points are to that, people like that don't vote, for questionable conservative parties. They don't feel scarcity, they feel abundance, and they feel richness, and they're not materialistic, and they're not consumers, and they're not vain, or less so, or at least, vain in a way where they can also appreciate other people's beauty, and it's all about this kind of reciprocity and balance. So that's ultimately what kind of all the areas that I engage with professionally, that I work in, how they're all related and tied together. And where, that's also where I get a lot of my gratification, because of course it's also driven by me as my experience of self. So between all of those social and political and personal and growth and expansion levels, I think that covers most of the bases that we were talking about.
That's great. It's a very coy look. So my wife's going to love that I'm flirting with you on this podcast. That's fantastic. It's going to be hard for this when she listens to it. So the political side I think is really interesting there. Let's take an issue like immigration. If you have an abundance mentality, that's going to be quite different to look at. Or we've been talking about listening and communication, right? Like I see listening to be massively lacking on the left and the right. Just, I think you can be a conservative embodied person. I have conservative leanings myself around certain subjects, and but there needs to be listening on both sides, right? It's this sort of conservative base and the liberal flyer, both are necessary. There's an embodiment part here for both, about openness, but also borders and containment. I think sometimes the Germans have sort of swung, talk about swinging, but swung from a kind of bordered fascism to a kind of openly unbounded liberalism, and neither's a very healthy embodied extreme.
Right.
In terms of looking at the kind of embodiment and the cultural history there, maybe that's a subject for another time. But it's how do you find, just last thing, because I'm fascinated by culture, how do you find the kind of West Coast openness fits with the German let me say structure? That's a fairly neutral word. So obviously they're cliches and it could be very prejudiced, but I've spent time in both places, and there definitely is a tendency towards openness on the West. And I know Berlin is a little different from the rest of Germany. It tends to have more of that openness, but in terms of structure and openness, how does that fit together?
These are actually really two quite fundamental perspectives, I think, that have always kind of been a little bit in conflict within me. Until I was about 20, I spent, I'd been going to the States regularly, but the majority of time for me was spent in Germany. And Germany, some of the fundamental frameworks, especially, in your, before your 20s and your teens, when you're in school, you're really confronted with the German system, where, in elementary school, you do this test. And if you're more, more like craft oriented, you go to this school. And if you're more intellectually oriented, you go to this school. And, if you don't go to university, then you get an apprenticeship, and the apprenticeship is this long certificate. And it's all very laid out and boxed out. And to me, I always had this idea, yes, of course, that's how you do it. There's a slot for everyone, and there's a certification, and you have to have the feedback, and it has to be laid out like this, and then for sure, and you get the ending at the end of your name. And then eventually I spent more time in the States, and I also got to see more people in alternative culture. I got to see more people who just didn't work that way for them. Somehow this didn't authentically and genuinely represent or tune in with the way that they perceive the world. And if it works for you, it's great. If it doesn't work for you, it's a constant struggle. And I've really come to appreciate this American attitude of like, yes, there's this fake it till you make it, and there's a slightly bullshitty feeling kind of vibe to it. But ultimately, ultimately is also, and I think the way, like, for example, the housing bubble affected the market in Germany, which is, also a big entanglement dynamic, even in the rise of the Third Reich. I mean, the crash of Wall Street, which was very much founded in the American attitude, how it affected, the political scheme in Germany. That the American system of everyone agreeing that if this is a great thing and we agree on the idea and we just go with it and go for it, it creates substance. It's this like idea of the rope that becomes a knot. If you just have the rope, it's just a string. But if you actually start kind of bunching it up and kind of giving it substance, then the knot has a substance. But if you release the knot, again, there's really nothing there that constitutes that besides the agreement of like, this is somehow useful. This is something I'm going to put energy into. So I've experienced in the States now that there is just a much more liberal attitude. If you can make it happen, then it counts. And in Germany, I've encountered, even if you're already making it happen, even if you have proof of concept, even if you're doing the thing, people will still question you if you don't have the paperwork, if you don't have, the agreement from this university and that thing, and the skepticism stays to the point where they would rather support someone who's not doing it, who's not pulling it off because they have the paperwork.
Yeah. Well, interesting. I know, when I've experienced in Russia, the certificates really matter that you give people at the end of a course, for example. And in Britain, we can be a bit negative around this. And it's a sort of theme on this podcast generally of kind of like, why are all the famous embodiment teachers American? And like, most of them. And certainly, some, partly it's because there's some really good ones. I want to acknowledge that. And partly I think it's just more this like ability to put it out there, and I think there's something in the moderating the bullshit of Europe, which is helpful. Like I always said, some of my favorite people are Americans who have spent time in Europe or vice versa. And, there's something about that balance between the sort of positive, go for it, put yourself out there, and the sort of, a little bit of skepticism with that can be healthy. Listen, I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time, but we need to wrap up, actually. I've just seen the clock. So this has been super fun.
Absolutely.
I've very much enjoyed it, beautiful beardy man. If people want to check out your beard, they can go to adrianiselin.com, right? So that's ISELIN, and Adrian spelled the normal way.com. Anywhere else people should be checking you out?
That's usually my central hub. My Instagram is on there. I put links to all of my kind of events. Mostly on the acro side, I haven't really posted my more sex positive work there. I was hosting the Berlin chapter of Kinky Salon here for a little bit. That's kind of evolving into another event currently. So, if that's something people want to get in touch about, my contact is there, and that's my main hub. That's where people.
Right. I'm now following you on Instagram like a fellow yoga tart. So yes, I'm on there with you now. Sir, this has been very good. Any final message about the body before we hang up?
I appreciate very much all the things I've gotten to say. I think I really got to share some of my core ideas and core beliefs there. So thanks so much for that invitation and that platform. And I'd love to hear from whoever hears it and feels inspired to collaborate or just to hear or just to share. I'm excited to see what becomes.
Great, thank you. And just for the listeners, if you ever want to reach out to the teachers, we have a Facebook group where the different teachers often will tag them and put them on there. And if you ever want to sort of chat or reach out to people, the Facebook group is relatively active, and that's a pretty good place for it. So Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.